Welcome everybody to the third session of our Acpf Watershed Applications training course. In the last week, we spent a whole session on the technical side of Acpf, and then the second session was all about the case studies. In this one, Matt and I are going to talk about presenting the Acpf results. What are some of the strategies for communicating the results? Matt's going to talk about some of the map design issues to consider. And all of this, we're going to try and give you a chance to figure out for yourself how you're going to use Acpf and answer some of those questions. So we hope you feel ready to ask questions throughout this as you start to think, what are you going to be doing with this? I want to do a little check the temperature in the room type of poll here. And Janice, I wonder if you could pull up the poll. And I'm just wondering, how many are y'all ready to start using the Acpf? What are you thinking? How useful is it to you? And if none of these responses quite fit where you're thinking, please add them to the chat. Got a few more people here to answer this. And as I said, if you're type your answer into the chat would be great. Agnes is already using it. Oh yeah, I forgot to put that in as one of the responses. All right, so we got most people, and there's a good number of you. Yep, you're ready to get started here. And then another big bunch that are, well, there's still some barriers here. Not sure if I'm going to be able to get over these barriers. And that's a real thing. You know, even if you want to use it, it just really relies on a lot of support and partnership from you know, between the state and the local level and the public and private, whatever it might be. So let's get started here. Yesterday, Ann Nardi sent out a link to this watershed capacity assessment, which is in your folder. Let's see if I can pull that up here. And this is something we put together to help you assess your readiness to use the Acpf, but more broadly, your readiness to do watershed work. And so you can just go through these questions on your own. They take a look at what is your readiness of the individuals in your community? And do you know, how well do you know the community that you're working with? What's the readiness of the social networks? You know, do people work together? Is there a certain a basic level of trust in the community? What's the readiness of the partnerships? Which partners can you be working with? And how well do you know these different organizations and what their particular strengths are that they can contribute? What's the readiness of the programs? Do you have the money and resources in place to do some of this work? What's the readiness of the goals? Do you have water resource goals that you're aiming towards? And then what's your technical readiness? Do you have the tools you need? Do you have the capacity to use those tools? So if you, I'd suggest having this in front of you as we talk through the next few slides and take some notes there. All right. So the first thing is, who are the users of of the ACPF. And there's the conservation partners, there we go, NRCS and Soil and Water Conservation District staff working at that local scale. Those are some of the most important folks working on ACPF. The federal, state, and regional agencies are really important too, because they're the ones that are likely to be providing the technical support and some of the financial support. It's likely that's where the people are who are going to be running the ACPF toolbox. That's where you might end up looking. And then the partner organizations are really integral to the whole success of applying ACPF. And you heard some interesting examples on last Thursday. In Iowa, the Iowa Soybean Association was really important, along with the state Department of Ag. In Indiana, it was a partnership between the NRCS, the Soil and Water Conservation Districts, the university, and the Environmental Defense Fund. So this public-private partnership. In Minnesota, it was the State Department of Ag. So in each case, it's always a different set of organizations. And then the individuals and the community leaders are really important. The landowners and farmers, they're the ones who are doing the actual land management. And then there's the watershed community. Perhaps you have watershed organizations. So under 3A on that community assessment sheet, take a moment and jot down who are the partners that you could be working with. To use ACPF and to more broadly do your watershed planning. In all of these partners and individuals, ACPF can be an opportunity to build some of these relationships. So if there's some of these partners you're looking to work with more and strengthen your relationship, you can do some of that work around the ACPF to jointly try and find the resources and the skills to do the work. You have to do some of the field checking and integrating it with other sources of information. So those are all chances that you can work with your partners and strengthen that. Okay, so what are some of the uses and why do I have this all? There we go. All right. These are some of the uses that you've heard about for using the ACPF. Kevin Keener, referring to the more efficient field visits, Kevin Keener talked about using the ACPF outputs to decide what sites to focus on and what practices when you go out into the field. And others have used the SPI, the Stream Power Index, which is one of the outputs from the toolbox. And they've used that to figure out where gullies are likely to be. So in both of these cases, you can study up at your desktop before you go out in the field. And you have to go out in the field. There's no way to get around that. But with the ACPF preparation, you know right where to look and you can prioritize your time. The maps that you create for that purpose might never be shared with landowners. So you would design those differently and you would include different information. You might keep them entirely electronic and not print them out. You want to make sure you can zoom in on specific fields. So that would be a different design than if you're using it with your outreach and engagement, where you might use it and present it to landowners and community groups. Carl Gesch mentioned using it to help prioritize the outreach related to specific practices in specific areas of the watershed. So once they were citing these practices, they could use these maps to work with producers to figure out exactly which practices to prioritize. Promoting watershed thinking. This can be pretty useful, especially if you're used to working with individual landowners and at that, who walks into the office kind of approach to conservation. If you have these ACPF maps that are showing some of these different practices around the watershed, you can put an individual farm or field in the context of what's going on upstream and downstream, and get away from feeling like this one site is going to make some big difference. It makes a difference because of how it's connected upstream and downstream. So it's useful to help illustrate that to people. In the case of multi-landowner projects or working with watershed groups, the ACPF maps are a great in to sort of test the waters, see how people are reacting to some of the ideas, and give them the information they need to actually give you good guidance on how to prioritize different sites. And then the final use I want to mention, and we haven't talked about this before, is using it in funding proposals. And I've seen this happen several times, because once you run the ACPF and you get this idea of there's a lot of there's a lot of opportunities for this practice, but there's really not for that practice. So this gives you this scientific validity to put into your proposal and say, this is what we think we can do, this is what would be helpful, and this is how many we may be able to do. So that can be pretty useful. As you're with any of these uses, there's a number of considerations to think about. The first is tailoring what you're doing to the audience, and Matt's going to talk more about that. And this is, if you've been working and doing watershed work, you understand this. You need to have some local knowledge of what are the preferences, who are the community leaders, what are the existing practices is really critical to know what's already out there before you start showing maps of we ought to do this, that, and that, and this. And a lot of that's already out there. And you need to understand the attitudes towards conservation and what are the red flags that are going to trip people up if you use the wrong language or whatever. So that, the tailoring to the audience. Targeting is a particular word that I want to highlight, and that's related to tailoring your message to the audience. It can really set people off, and so you have to know if that's. We use targeting quite a bit internally to talk about targeting practices and targeting particular watersheds or whatever it might be, but it can be much more threatening to farmers and landowners if they are feeling targeted. So consider other words for that, and other ways of framing it, and showing a watershed map and showing why a particular farm is an opportunity, and not because that person is being picked on. That relates to making sure that you're presenting this information as non-prescriptive, that the ACPF presents the options, or really like Joe Magner's analogy to the ACPF cafe, where the ACPF provides the menu of options. The conservation staff take the orders. The TSPs are the culinary experts that put the packages together, and the farmers enjoy their meal. Well, I hope they enjoy their meal. Maps, the design of the map, you need to consider how you're doing the symbols and presenting this, and how verbally you present it to a group to make sure that they feel this is non-prescriptive and that this is giving them options, not pushing something down their throat. Field verification is critical to any of this work with the ACPF. And part of that is, again, document and verify the presence of existing practices and the quality of those existing practices. And then there's always, what the ACPF comes up with in its algorithms are never a perfect estimate of what's out there. So you really need to go and check this information. Which is pretty important to building trust and credibility. And the final thing is privacy. The ACPF uses publicly available data, but still the data privacy and protection is important. When you're sharing the outputs, make sure you exclude as much personally identifiable information of the landowners as you can. And yeah, it's really local decisions to figure out how to do that. So, and I again welcome questions from people if you have issues with privacy that you've been dealing with. So, looking at all these considerations and thinking about it, the next question is, what do you need to learn about your audience? What do you know enough that you can work with them using the ACPF? And these things fit under item 1 and 2 in your worksheet. I'm going to give you just a minute to think about that. And then I'm going to flip through these pretty quickly. You have each of these graphics in your folder of materials. What is that folder called? There's a subfolder called Graphics Showing Integration of ACPF into Watershed Planning. And that's all 4 of these. These are also available on the ACPF website. This one is the NRCS 9, I always get this wrong, the 9-step conservation planning process, the whole farm planning process. And some of you might be really familiar with using this. And ACPF, what this graphic shows is the ways that ACPF fits into each of these different phases. There's also a graphic here for area-wide planning and where it can fit into that whole process. Our third graphic is the crosswalks ACPF with the EPA 9-element plans, and where does the ACPF fit into each of those. And all of this, some of you are using one of these planning processes, others are using other types of tools and processes. And this is a graphic we put together for Wisconsin, and I think it's worth looking at for any state. It might be helpful to prepare something like this. At each scale, at the state level, the Huck 8, down to the minor watersheds, and down to the farm and field scale, there's different goals different kinds of goals at each of those scales. There's different plans. You might have a nutrient reduction strategy at the state level, and down to the farm scale, you've got engineering design. So that's, planning means something different in all of these. And this bottom part is, where does the ACPF fit at each of these scales? But look at this row of tools. At the Huck 8 or county scale, you can be doing SWOT modeling. At the Huck 12 scale, that's where the ACPF comes in. In Wisconsin, they also use eval and SNAP Plus and so on. And each state would fill this out differently. So I would just ask, what are the planning tools that you use? Do you know what's the short list of tools that you need to be using? And this fits under number 6 in the capacity assessment sheet. And yes, I have seen, I'm looking at the chat, the ACPF, have you seen the ACPF used in the National Water Quality Initiative Watershed Assessments? Which, yeah, I have seen that in Minnesota. They've, some of the, I'm trying to think now. Yeah, in Minnesota, we're trying to get it into that EPA 9-element planning process. So they've linked it to the National Water Quality Initiative as well. That certainly fits there nicely. Okay, my last slide here before I hand off to Matt is to talk about the ACPF requirements. And this all fits under your section 6E to I in the in your worksheet there. If you're going to use ACPF, you need to have the expertise. And there's 2 kinds of expertise: that moderate proficiency in ArcGIS, but also the knowledge of the local landscape and practices. So you need to have access to both of those. The second thing is you need enough time. If you've got a GIS specialist who knows their stuff, knows their way around ArcGIS, then they could technically learn ACPF in about 2 days plus some practice. In reality, it takes some more practice and trying it out and trial and error and such. But that's about the amount of time that it would take to learn ACPF. Then you need to hydromodify the digital elevation model and define the flow networks. And that can take a couple days for a single Huck 12. Running the ACPF toolbox for the rest of the tools actually goes pretty quick. That can take half a day. And then developing the output into display maps, which is what Matt is going to talk more about. Choosing which output to combine, what else to include, all of those questions. That can take more or less time depending how complicated that gets. For software, you need ArcGIS Pro with the Spatial Analyst extension. This is not the cheap license. It's not, you need to have the full version of this. And then the support resources, ACPF for watersheds.org is a great place for a whole lot of resources, and the National Hub, which you'll be hearing about from Pam in a few minutes. All right, I am going to hand off to Matt. If I can stop sharing here.
All right, thanks, Marcel. Let me share my screen. All right. Well, good morning, everybody. Happy to be with you today. I'm going to talk a little bit about presenting these results, kind of more some of the cartographic concepts about how you would display the actual maps and some of the different options you have when doing that. So the majority of what I'm going to spend my time here is going to be on actual presenting the maps, presenting the results. So I'm going to walk through just choosing media. So you have different options you can choose from, how you want to present these ACPF results depending on the circumstances that you find yourself in. So there's different options. We'll go through those. I have a bunch of different examples that I've put in here to kind of give you just a high-level overview of what some of those different types of media look like. Once you've kind of chosen the media, how you want to display the maps, you need to make sure that you have those outputs tailored to suit the specific audience that you're going to be engaging. So we'll go through some of the options that are available to tailor the outputs. And then when you're having these watershed meetings and going over ACPF, it's always really important to be prepared to get feedback from the audience and be prepared to learn something about sharing these results. So I've put a couple bullet points together. We'll talk about that real quick. And then we're going to go on to spend a little bit of time to try to get some audience engagement. I have a hands-on exercise that we're going to walk through just to kind of get you a little bit more comfortable with how you would actually use these ACPF results for watershed planning applications. And then before I'm done today, I have one slide that I'm going to share some specific results for resources that Ohio users would be interested in. All right, so when we're talking about choosing the type of media that we want to display our ACPF results, you know, whether we're talking about printed maps, they can be a really good option. You might be finding yourself doing something like this where you want to do a slideshow, or you have to do a presentation to a larger room where a PowerPoint kind of presentation may be more appropriate. So that's always an option to do screenshots and things like that. Some circumstances might be appropriate to do a narrated video to talk about what the planning is for a specific watershed that's going on. Then there's also some kind of digital options like web maps and story maps, which we can go a little bit into as well. So really depending on what the specific situation is that you find yourself in, you can think about all of these different types of media and how they might be effective at trying to you know, accomplish the goals that you have. So one of the kind of basic first things that we always talk about is print maps. So this is kind of the standard go-to once we do some kind of, you know, ACPF or any kind of GIS, you know, thing that we want to share with people. You know, we can display this in a print map. These are really useful for showing a whole bunch of different things. You can see here that I have this output from the ACPF is the nutrient removal wetlands for one of these watersheds that I ran. And this is pretty good to look at the whole watershed and kind of see on an overview where the opportunities exist to cite this practice in this Huck 12 watershed. So you can make print maps of all of these different practices, whatever you're interested in, and you can take these to meetings or out to different landowners and share these with them. Here's a couple of other examples of some print maps that I made. These are examples that I've included to kind of highlight this idea that, you know, it's not always the best idea to use print maps. It can be a little bit difficult to see some of these small field features when you're looking at a whole watershed scale map. So the one on the left there, that's the water and sediment control basins. And you can see from the watershed map, it's really hard to pick out, you know, where, you know, each of those are at in the fields. So when I actually made these were actually for watershed meetings that I was going out to the watershed, hanging these up on the wall where we could get landowners to come around and look at them. So when I printed these out, they were 17 inches high by 11 inches wide. So they're a little bit larger, and you can kind of walk up to them and see the individual fields, but it's tough when you're looking at that whole watershed, right? So you have options. You can maybe think about doing some kind of inset maps to show a different zoomed in area of that larger map that you can kind of see that I've done there on the left, but it can get kind of difficult. So print maps can be good in some applications, but they have their limitations as well. So an example like that, where you want to show some of those smaller field level or field scale practices on an actual, you know, actual fields out there to show to people, you might consider just doing a map at a different scale. So here you can see that this area is zoomed in to, it's just a little red box that's shown in the small map up there in the upper right corner. So we're just looking at that small area, zoomed into a handful of fields in that area. So this can be a really useful way to make some maps if you have a producer in that area that maybe one or two families are responsible for farming the whole number of fields in that area. You could do some zoomed in maps, and this would be really appropriate just to go out and share with a couple landowners in that area. But you can also, you know, understand that it's probably, in order to do kind of watershed engagement over this whole area, it's going to take a lot of maps to kind of go over the whole watershed and engage individual landowners about conservation practices everywhere. So it's a little bit of a trade-off if you want to look at the field scale versus the watershed scale, kind of what you're able to see and what you're able to share with people. So all things to be taken into consideration when you're making these print maps, or when you're having, I guess, the GIS technicians make the print maps for you. So another good option to consider for sharing these results is Google Earth. So this is a free software that everybody can access. So while everybody might not have access to ArcGIS or have the technical ability to be able to know how to use that software, Google Earth's a little simpler and it's free, so everybody can have access to it. And we can package up these ACPF result layers into a KML file, and they're pretty simple to just email over to people and share them that way. And it's nice and interactive, so you can zoom in and out. You can change the perspective of which way you're looking at properties, and it has all of the neat Google features that are available with the different layers and stuff that you can incorporate. So this is a good option that's kind of a little bit more of a step up than a printed out map. But again, this is maybe more appropriate if you're just trying to email somebody some results or something like that. Another step up from that would be if maybe you don't even want to email a file, or if you don't want to have your end user require that they have Google Earth. And you maybe just want to send them a link, or have a QR code on a handout that your participants could just scan with their phone or an iPad, or maybe just go to the link on their computer. They can do a web map, which is what I have here. So this is the same as the print outputs, but I've taken all of those ACPF layers and I put them into this web application. And let me see if I can drop the link here in the chat. So I put the link in the chat there. You guys can click on that link and you guys can go and check that out. It's nice because you can zoom in and out to different areas of the watershed. You can toggle off and on different practices that you might be interested in. Each of these results, if you remember from the technical discussion, have attributes that are associated with this. So each of the layers have information that you can, in the interactive version, you can click on the actual feature in the map and you should get a pop-up that has all of that attribute information as well that's associated with each of the layers. So that's the web map, and those are really nice to have to share these outputs with folks. And then the last example of a different type of media that I have here that I wanted to share with everybody is this story maps. So story maps are kind of a different take on presenting this digital GIS data. And as the name would suggest, it's more of a story. So this could be really useful with the right target audience if you're trying to give the whole story of a watershed, and maybe why conservation is needed, or maybe some examples of some projects that have been implemented and you want to show to stakeholders what the impact has been. Story maps can be a really effective way to do that. A little bit of a caution to story maps is that they're a little bit difficult to put together. They take some time, and I've seen plenty of really bad story maps. So it's really important to have a good storyboard and a good storyline together to talk about when you're going to set these up and how they should be how they should be made. So let me see if I can share this with you. All right, so hopefully you're seeing the story map now. So this is an example of a story map that's in the St. Mary's watershed over in Indiana. And you can see that they just have a nice picture of one of the stream networks on here. And you can kind of scroll through these story maps, and they show different information about where we're located, kind of what's going on from the conservation perspective in this area. And as you scroll through these, you have different opportunities to inset different layers from the GIS in here. So these are different outputs and different GIS layers. So you can see some of the different conservation practices and the watershed boundary layers and the stream networks that were derived from this analysis. And they have some little text that can kind of go on to kind of explain to people what they're supposed to be looking at here. So water and sediment control basins practice is one of the outputs from Acpf. So this map kind of shows, it talks about what WASCOBs are, shows where they're located. And as you continue to scroll, you can show different practices here. So and you can see some of the features that pop up with this as well. Now, I thought this would zoom in to the different layers. Let me try refreshing this real quick. Okay, here we go. So now I think it's doing. So as you scroll through this, you can see, okay, WASCOBs, it has the pictures that actually change. Grass waterways, bioreactors. So it's showing actually the different outputs from the Acpf analysis as we scroll through here. So more information about what this practice is. You can see the contour buffer strips, where those were located in this watershed. And you can kind of see how you can walk people through the different practices and kind of give them a high level overview of what Acpf has to offer and kind of what some of those outputs look like, and talk about how they can be used for conservation planning. So this is one example of a story map and how one person has used this for a watershed that was done. I have one more example on here of a story map. So this one was done a little bit differently. This is a watershed. I believe this is in Iowa. And this this one's set up a little bit different. So this story map actually has tabs across the tops of the screen here that you can select different options. But this first tab is actually kind of a short video that kind of does an overview of the Acpf and talks a little bit just generally about what it is. So we can go to the next tab, and this actually talks about the watershed that they were analyzing here, and then has just a bunch of information about the watershed and a map showing some of the output layers. So this is the land use classification and showing what some of the crop land uses are in that area. And if you keep going through the different layers, you can see that this one is, this tab is having the outputs for all of the Acpf tools that have to do with runoff control. On the left here, there's some information talking about all these different outputs. Some of this information is directly from the user's guide, so you can kind of get an idea of how the outputs were derived or what kind of goes into them. And then you can zoom into the watershed and kind of get a better idea at a field scale where some of these practices work. So if you're working with landowners, you can go right to their farm and start having those conversations about individual practices that they might be considering. So again, this is showing a bunch of different practices that you might consider using for runoff control. We have grass waterways, contour buffer strips, water and sediment control basins. If you were interested in more of these water detention storage practices, they have another tab up here that highlights those practices. So here we have depressions, WASCOBs. There's another tab for this tile drainage treatment. So different practices that could be associated with treating tile drainage. saturated buffers, those denitrifying bioreactors, controlled drainage. So depending on where you're at in this watershed, you can zoom around and figure out what's appropriate in those different areas. So this is right along the stream here. This is that Riparian Assessment corridor. And I think that these are identifying locations that would be suitable for saturated buffers. There's also the Riparian Management tools. So the Riparian assessment functions, what types of vegetation or riparian management would be appropriate in each of those different stream segments on that riparian corridor. And this last tab here that they have has basically has the options where you can select the different layers that you would want to see. So if you're interested in edge of field bioreactors and WASCOBs only, you can turn those layers on and you can go to your area in the watershed and see what options are available for you. All right, so those are story maps. Those are really neat. They do take some work to put together though, but like I said, they can be really, really useful in the right applications for the right audiences. So switch back to my PowerPoint here. All right, so those are some of the different types of media that you can choose from. And again, you know, it's just going to depend on the type of circumstance you find yourself in. If it's a big room, if it's a small audience out in the field, whether you're doing a virtual presentation, you know, you have all these different things to consider about how you want to present these maps and what the best, you know, best way of doing that is. So the other kind of part of this is actually tailoring the outputs. So once you've kind of decided, you know, the type of media that you want to use, there's all kinds of stuff with the individual layers and the maps that you can adjust, or more likely this would be the GIS technician or cartographer that is making the maps, that is going to make a lot of these decisions. I think it's important for anybody who's going to be using these outputs. So anybody on this call that's going to be using these is going to have to probably work with their GIS tech or their cartographer to kind of, you know, as a little bit of a back and forth to say, you know, this is the kind of map that I want to have. We need to have a zoomed in map to show, you know, the watershed that we're working on, but we want to have like a larger area that shows where that watershed is in the context of the larger region, for example, like I have here. So those are all going to be conversations that you need to have when you're deciding what kind of outputs to produce, to use in a presentation. And then when you're making these maps, there's all of these different things that go into them. So you can have conversations about, you know, what scale that map needs to be, the physical size of the map. Like I was talking to you, the ones that I printed out and hung out on the wall were like 17 by 11 inches. That's just what our printer was able to handle. You know, if you can get bigger ones, that's something that you can talk about doing, but that's something you have to consider when you're going to be making these materials, is how large do you need that print map to be. If you're having a large watershed and you're trying to show some of those smaller features, do you need to have some of those inset maps inside the larger map area to show different smaller zoomed in areas? And then whether you were doing print maps or some kind of digital version, symbology of the layers is important. So that's talking about what color and what shape and size are all of the points, lines, and polygons that we're using to display the outputs here. What colors are they? How large are they? All that stuff can be changed inside the GIS. So those things can all be discussed, you know, with the person making those maps. If there's a way that you would rather display those outputs, those can all be adjusted. Another common thing in setting up a map to make it look nice is what kind of base map you want to have. I think that there's probably been several examples here that we've given that have shown natural color imagery as a base map, like you see that I have here. Sometimes maybe a more simplistic map would be suitable just to show the outputs. So those are options. All of the things with the different types of font types, sizes from all the text that you can see that might exist in the map. Those are all things that can be edited and made to suit your needs. And then that last bullet point that I have there, title, scale bar, north arrow, legend, reference, and neat line. So those are all things that should go into any kind of print map. And there's always all kinds of different options for how you might want to display those or arrange them. So those are just some things to be aware of. If you're not, the one making the map, you can work with the person that's going to be making the map to get them how you want. So they're going to be best suited for your target audience. And then you can annotate any of these maps. So once you have your kind of finished product down there, or your finished results in a map, and you want to use those for planning process, some kind of planning process, it might be helpful to go over your maps and annotate them, actually circling practices that might be feasible for a certain landowner or something like that. So annotations can be made on these maps. And then the last thing I have here is incorporating ancillary information. So what I mean by this is an example of this top picture. These are 7 watersheds where I ran Acpf analyses for in Northwest Ohio. As part of those Acpf analyses, there were the nutrient removal wetlands layer as one of the outputs. So nutrient removal wetlands are a really popular conservation practice that have been, really popular in Ohio lately. There's a lot of different funding opportunities and things to get some more of these installed. So there was another organization that was actually, they received some funding to install some of these nutrient removal wetlands in this area. And they were trying to figure out, okay, where can we approach some landowners, or where can we try to cite some of these practices? And you can see the map there, they had some different method they were using to kind of narrow down potential locations. I'm not sure what their method was, but it wasn't Acpf. It wasn't a terrain analysis. They had some other method. And their method returned all of those purple polygons that you're seeing in the map there. Those were all of their potential locations for nutrient removal wetlands, which was a lot. It was a lot for them to sift through. So they knew I was doing these Acpf analysis in this region, and they approached me and they asked me, do you have any nutrient removal wetlands from these Acpfs that you've run that kind of overlap areas that we've identified, thinking that could be a good way for them to target or to narrow down some of the potential options that they had. And you can see in the bottom picture there, there was a handful of nutrient removal wetlands in this watershed that overlapped areas that they also identified with their method. So they've taken those couple of areas, and they've figured out who the landowners are on those properties, and now they're using those to reach out and see if those are good places to actually try to target some of these locations to actually implement the practice. So this is what I mean by incorporating ancillary information, and you can kind of see how Acpf can also be used in that planning process with other efforts as well. All right, so the last slide I have here just to talk real quick about is being prepared for feedback. All right, so this is really important to do, just to be prepared. There's a lot of work that goes into doing these Acpf assessments, and the whole idea is to use them to do watershed planning for conservation. So once we get out there to present some of these results, a lot of times you're going to have people that have questions about them, or they might be interested in a practice, or a whole number of things. And it's important to be prepared to address the needs of the group when you're actually there after you've presented these results. So, that might just be taking note of some of the things that people are talking about. What are people interested in that area? If there are people that are real interested, this is a good opportunity to start taking names and phone numbers so you can continue those discussions later on with them. If this is for, writing a watershed plan and you need input from actual stakeholders in that watershed to inform the plan, it might be, you might have some specific questions that you want to have answered from a group meeting that you're holding when you're going over these results. So you might have a survey with those questions prepared. So you're prepared to get that information right there at the meeting. Funding opportunities are another thing that inevitably comes up when you start talking about some of these conservation practices and wanting to get them cited on actual, farm fields. They're out there. So be prepared to talk about, possible funding opportunities. Acpf is, it's independent of, funding opportunities. So there are always a variety of different options to have that you can consider depending on where you're at and what's going on in your area. So just maybe be prepared there with some information about what funding opportunities are available. And then another big part of this is a lot of these or all of these practices that we're running with Acpf are based on NRCS practice standards. So actually having those NRCS standards available for people to check out could be another option, just to have more information for people interested in these things. All right, so I'll take a minute here. Does anybody have any questions about any of the maps, stuff that we've went over, or anything that Marcel has discussed? If not, the next thing we have is we're going to work on a hands-on exercise, and we're going to try to get some more audience participation with this. So I'm going to kind of go over this hands-on exercise with everybody, and then Janice is going to split us into, I think, 3 groups, and we're going to kind of work through this in our little groups, and then come back after 20 minutes, and we're going to just talk about what each of the groups, what each of them decided to do for their exercise. All right, so for each of these groups that we're going to break out into, we want to make sure that we identify somebody in the group's going to want to take notes, and then somebody's going to be responsible for reporting back to the larger group what you guys discussed about. So I'll let you guys can all decide who's going to do that in your little groups once we break up, but I'll just go over kind of the instructions here, generally what we're going to do. So let's see, identify the note taker, and then we have an Excel sheet that's going to be in your participants folder. So you guys will be able to navigate to the participants folder and find these documents that we're using for the handout. Once you're into a breakout room, you're going to know if you're group 1, 2, or 3. So just grab the corresponding documents. Each one of them is a little bit different, so each group will have a different example to work through. You could just review the Excel sheet and rank the top 10 practices based on the discussion questions. So the discussion questions are down here. So we're basically going to ask, we're going to give you a watershed, and we're going to ask you to choose what your resource concern is in that watershed. So you might be considering doing some kind of wetland restoration. You might be interested in addressing nutrient loss in a watershed. You might be interested in protecting wildlife habitat. So that can vary depending on maybe what's important to you locally. So we're going to let you guys choose what your resource concern is. And then based on that, you're going to get to pick which practices you're going to, which practices you want to focus on implementing to address that resource concern. All right, so you have some different options that you'll go through, and you just have to think about, for this watershed, what are we trying to do, and what practices do we want to implement. So I think that a couple of the groups have some additional information in besides just the watershed map in the Excel sheet, I think some of the groups have an additional map in there that shows some existing conservation that is actually happening in the watershed. So that can be taken into account. If that helps your purpose, you can use that to help guide what your choices are. If it doesn't help your purpose, you can ignore it. All right, so we're going to give you some numbers here to use for this. And I think that it's important just to realize that the numbers we're giving you are just some canned data that we had come up with based on, I think, some information out of Wisconsin. But really, you should really know that, you know, any of the actual efficacy of these practices and how they perform on the landscape is going to vary a whole lot depending on where you're at and where these practices are actually cited. So this is a real oversimplification of what the actual planning process is like. But the idea here is just to kind of get you to start walking through the steps about, okay, this is what the Acpf results are. This is what our resource concern is. And this is how we would kind of start to go about putting together a watershed plan using these outputs. All right, so this is an example of one of the watersheds that we have here, and you can see that there's a bunch of different Acpf assessment outputs. There are a bunch of different Acpf outputs around this watershed that you could choose from. You don't have to use all of these for your conservation purpose, but you're going to pick a few of them, and you're going to try to meet your conservation goals using those. So these will tell you what the conservation practice is down here in the legend, and you can see where they're located at in the watershed. So depending on what your resource concern is that you're trying to address, you're going to pick your conservation practice based on its effectiveness at reducing nutrients or whatever that environmental thing is here. So we have a little chart up here in the top right that kind of gives you that estimated annual pollutant removal rate for a few different practices. So you can kind of think, all right, are you interested in reducing total nitrogen, phosphorus, total suspended solids? And based on the numbers here, you can kind of get an idea of which practice may be more effective at doing that. And, you know, however many of them are on the landscape is going to kind of guide you into determining what you're going to do. So you can pick your practices based on that. Once you've picked kind of generally what your practices are, you find them on the map. And then you can come over here and you can see that, for example, this is a bioreactor right here. And bioreactor has a number, I think that's 595. So you can come over here to the list and you find that that specific output. So B595 is right here. This is going to tell you, you know, the area that the practice takes up, and some more information about it and the contributing area to that practice. So that could be an important one when you're trying to estimate how much area in that watershed is going to be treated by this one practice. And then this is actually giving you the estimated annual pollutant removal rate for the specific practice that's located at that location in the watershed. So here you can see we have two different bioreactors, but because they're different locations in the watershed, they can be different sizes and they could have different nutrient removal rates. So that's the idea, what you're going to try to work through in your groups. Again, start with just choosing what your resource concern is, figure out what practices you want to use to address that resource concern, figure out where those are at on the map, and what your nutrient removal rates are here. And then once you get enough of them to address your resource concern, we'll kind of report back to everybody and talk about what everybody did differently. So I'll leave it with that. We'll take, I guess, does anybody have questions before we get started? I can take questions now as a group, and then we're going to break out into a few different groups. And I think we're going to try to have one person in each group to kind of help moderate this. But if there are questions about what you need to do before we do our breakout, I can take those now.
And Matt, we're going to shorten this since we're running a little behind here. Well, down to 12 to 15 minutes. There's,
Okay, yeah, that should be fine.
yeah.
All right, well, if there are no questions before we break out, I'll have Janice go ahead and break us all up into some groups. Once you get into your group, figure out what your group number is, and you get your corresponding materials from the participants folder then on the Google Drive.
Are we ready to break?
Let's do it.
All right.
So just click join on when you get your invitation to join a group.
All right.
Welcome
Not
back. We still have one more group that is, oh, they're
Coming
joining
back
us now.
Yep.
Yep. Just a mention note, your cameras and mics will be live when you return. So just a word of warning about that.
All right, so we had a little bit, I think, of a mix up in our group. I think by the time we might have had the wrong Excel sheet in there or something like that. It seemed like maybe some of the numbers were not on the list how they were supposed to be. So we're gonna have to, I think, go back and look at some of those, make sure we have the right documents in the right folder. How did those go in the other groups? Marcel, were you in one of the breakout rooms? How did it go for yours?
Yeah, I had group 2 and I guess Wendy or someone else, do you want to just comment on how our conversation went?
Sure. Yeah, our group decided to focus on nutrient reductions as our goal and our priority. We decided to look at the list of the practices that ACPF had suggested, sort that list by their effectiveness at removing the nutrients. Some of the other information that we wanted to have, but that we didn't have, were things about what is the financial assistance available, what are the landowner inputs, where do we have willing participants, how much land are they willing to take out of production if that's necessary. So looking at the size of the practice and its contributing area in terms of feasibility, I guess. And then also thinking about budget-based prioritization, like if we have a funding source, but it's limited, how do we choose? Maybe we choose practices that are less expensive to implement.
How about the third group? And I don't know Matt, which group were you?
We were group 4.
Okay, group 3 is that. What did you talk about and what information do you wish you had as you had that conversation?
Yeah, this is Lee Moser for group 3. We had a watershed that had quite a few wetland restoration opportunities identified, so we decided to prioritize that. We had several discussions about ways that we would try to prioritize those. And we looked at some of the efficiency numbers. The larger wetlands seem to have higher nutrient reduction, sediment reduction values or efficiencies. So with the nutrient reduction and sediment habitat improvement and restoration goals, we kind of had multiple goals when we were talking about what we would want to pursue these for. We thought that we would potentially investigate the 3 largest wetlands within the watershed. And then that brought up the question of land ownership. Large acreage wetlands may be across multiple owners. So we figured that it would be best to try to either obtain parcel data or reach out to local agencies that could provide that ownership information and engage the owners, potentially engage them with maps to show them what we're talking about, and maybe overlay existing wetlands in the watershed to kind of provide that information to share with the owners and perhaps any of the agencies that we interact with. That's kind of the direction we went.
Yeah, so existing information about the landowners, who's willing. Are there other than, you know, if you were at a public meeting and you're a landowner or something and you get handed all of this information, how do you wish the maps had been designed differently? What information, what other information do you wish you had? Are there any other comments out there in that regard from any of the groups? If you were in charge of designing these maps, what would you have done differently? Yes, is what we're asking here.
Well, in group 4, we had an existing conservation map. I'm not sure if all of the groups had that. So that would be helpful.
I understand the need for a static map here, but I would have personally considered toying with one of the interactive mapping solutions for both presentation purposes and maybe individual landowner engagement if they have a device that you could present it to them on.
Yeah, good idea.
Well, that's good. It sounds like some people got some good takeaways from that exercise, at least to try to get you thinking about how ACPF is used to actually do the conservation planning. So that was a real oversimplification of the process, but hopefully it started to kind of get you to think down the road, how this is done. So I think we'll have to probably look and make sure we have our documents straightened out. I know our group probably had a couple people that I think stepped away at the same time too. So I think we can kind of go on. I think Marcel has some more to address with us. And then we have a couple more slides about state specific resources to kind of end on. So.
No, I'm done. I got that review of resources done, the ACPF resources as mentioned back in my first presentation. So the next few presentations is what's going on in Ohio, Indiana, and the national hub. So see what's out there. So Matt, if you want to talk about Ohio, that would be great.
Sure. Let me share my screen again. I just have one more slide to show you guys with some Ohio specific resources. All right, so really in Ohio, well, the big thing with ACPF is, the main layer that we're using to do the terrain analysis is the digital elevation model. And that's something that has to be user supplied because the data comes from a different place, usually in every state. So we can't just have one database that everybody goes to. In Ohio, we have a high resolution digital elevation model that's available for the whole state. This data is able to be accessed through the Ohio Geographically Referenced Information Program. So OGRIP is, you can search for that and you can go right to the website. The data is collected. It's available through a download tool there. So if you guys are more on the Watershed application, putting together meetings and stuff for this, you might not be so involved in actually having to get the data sources and stuff, but this is a reference for where that data is located in Ohio. Other resources in Ohio. So one of the things that I've been kind of involved with a lot is trying to develop this Ohio ACPF Hub. So this is supposed to be a place for people to be able to come in the state of Ohio to share their data, whether we have groups that are developing the core databases to make available for the rest of the state. So ACPF analyses can be run on watersheds in those areas, or whether we're talking about uploading results data. We're trying to have kind of one centralized repository where people can kind of go and submit that data to a place to be shared. So I'm working on that with a team from OSU. So hopefully we're going to be getting that rolled out in the near future, and that will be a good place for to kind of build the resources in Ohio around. We're going to have things on there about you know, any kind of specific documentation or best practices that exist in the state will be hosted on the Ohio Hub. If there's information that occurs about training events that are going to be happening, whether there's any kind of ACPF meetings that are going on in the state, we'll have information of that about that kind of stuff posted on our hub. Right now, we've been doing, there's a couple of groups that meet in Ohio to talk about ACPF every couple months. There's a modelers group meeting for folks who do actually the GIS analysis. And they're interested in kind of learning what other people in the state are doing with ACPF and what some of the best practices are that we use in Ohio. You know, we have meetings every so often to talk about those. Those are actually hosted by the Nature Conservancy. The other thing here is this mailing list. So we've just started this mailing list as a way to try to facilitate communication in the state between all of the different stakeholders that are interested in ACPF. So that link that you see there can take you straight to the mailing list, which is going to be housed on our national or our Ohio hub. So once that is available, you can just go to the hub and get that. But for now, I'm going to put this link in the chat as well. And if you guys are interested in signing up for the Ohio mailing list, you can do it right there. And then in terms of contacts in the state, if anybody has questions about you know, ACPF, how to get into contact with other people that are doing ACPF in the state, you can use me as a central resource, and I can kind of try to get you to the right people. Hopefully once our you know, Ohio hub is better, that'll be a little bit easier to facilitate that process of making connections. But right now I'm willing to kind of serve as that link between anybody that needs help making contact in the state. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen, and that's all I have for you guys.
Thank you, Matt. And a reminder that in the agenda are the links to Matt's email and all the other presenters' emails. At this point, Sam Strobel, excuse me, from Indiana is going to talk about some of the resources there. So if you could introduce yourself and talk about what's going on in Indiana.
Yep. Hi, my name is Sam Strobel. I am a GIS and data analysis for the Indiana State Department of Agriculture. Do I share my screen, or is someone else gonna share the PowerPoint?
Go ahead. Why don't you share yours?
All right. Yeah, I just have a few slides. So I guess first in Indiana, we kind of work through what we call the Indiana Conservation Partnership. So there's a bunch of state agencies and USDA and Purdue and local soil and water districts kind of all work together on conservation projects. And also, we have a bunch of private partners, which are probably less involved with the ACPF, but notably the Nature Conservancy kind of has their own ACPF projects in Indiana. So right now, Indiana's kind of in the early phases of kind of creating infrastructure to use ACPF in conservation planning. So NRCS and us and other agencies are kind of getting together to kind of brainstorm how we're gonna do this and what it looks like and that kind of stuff like that. So we've kind of come up with that we want to have staff trained around the state in how to do it and how to interpret results, and all the good stuff we've been learning about. Kind of a method for getting new staff up to speed when we kind of transition staff in and out of the agencies. So especially with those field staff, we want to make sure that they're aware of it and that they're kind of getting trained in its usage as they kind of onboard. And then also kind of some sort of online storage and kind of receptacle for the outputs, so that they're kind of accessible to everyone from a centralized location. So far, ACPF has kind of just been done piecemeal for a few Huck 12 watersheds, kind of where there was interest. We've had a few cohorts of staff go through some trainings like this one. And yeah, there's kind of that specific thing in Southwest Indiana, and then the Nature Conservancy has been working with ACPF for some of their efforts, and they have been using a consultant to do the actual ACPF runs. So this is a map, it's a little old map, so there's probably a few more Huck 12s that have been run since we made this, but this is kind of what we've done so far. Another kind of thing coming down the pipeline for us is that we have received funding through these RCCP grants for Kankakee and Western Lake Erie Basin, and that is going, a component that is going to be using the ACPF for some, maybe all of the Huck 12s within there, and we'll probably be hiring an intern to help us like facilitate doing the running of them. So kind of challenges going forward. We don't have kind of the input data prepared for a lot of the states. So if people want to do outside of the area that's kind of been centrally prepared by the ACPF people, you have to take that extra step to prepare the input, which is challenging for people. And then kind of building the infrastructure with staff has been a bit of a challenge, just getting people throughout the state who kind of are enthusiastic about using it. And then funding, especially for kind of the GIS people, is a challenge as well. So for kind of context for people within and outside of the state, kind of our main point of contact for NRCS is Shannon Zazula. He kind of is spearheading a lot of the efforts logistically for ACPF. And then Trevor Lorries, he is the kind of head of ISDA soil conservation. Jennifer Thumb is kind of the person behind all the RCCP grants. And then for questions about running ACPF within Indiana, you can contact me. And that is pretty much it. Is there any questions?
Thank you, Sam. And then our last presentation is from Pam Mixel to talk about the National Hub, which we are particularly excited about having this resource for all things ACPF. So Pam, if you would introduce yourself and go ahead and share.
Absolutely. So let's see. Can you guys see my screen okay?
Not quite yet. Oh, there we go. Yep, looks good.
All right. So I am Pam Mixel. I am the project specialist for the ACPF National Hub. So 100% of my time is dedicated to communication, outreach, strategy, anything and everything National Hub. So I'm just going to take a few minutes to kind of wrap up our session today. walking you through what's going on at the National Hub. And first, I just want to, thank you all for participating in this course. And ultimately, once we're done with these 3 sessions, I hope you've gained some new insights and ideas for applying the ACPF, in your home watersheds, in the coming years. But today specifically, I'm just going to give a brief intro to the National Hub, especially for any of you who are kind of new to us, outline some of our current products and services, give a few statistics about those, discuss some of our recently completed projects that we've been working on, and look at some of the projects that we have in development. So the National Hub, we're actually at our 1-year anniversary. We were officially organized this time last year with funding and support from the NRCS. And our mission is centered around improving the efficiency and effectiveness of ACPF implementation in conservation planning. And we've got a particular focus on helping to serve the NRCS in their conservation planning efforts. But essentially, what we're trying to do is make a scientifically based approach to conservation planning easy and practical to use. And we want to help you and your teams meet your goals for soil health and water quality at both the local scale and a larger regional scale. And under our current partnership structure, our team is comprised of groups from the Iowa Water Center, North Central Regional Water Network, Iowa State University, University of Wisconsin, and the Minnesota Water Resources Center. And then within these partners, we've got an administrative team that deals with our strategy, focus, and finances, reporting as part of our project. The technical team deals with our tools, our databases, technical guides, technical support, and our training team is responsible for our curriculum and conducting trainings like this one that we're doing today. And our communication and outreach team helps to create some of our non-technical resources, help to build our ACPF community, promoting ACPF use and making that connective network. And then pictured in the middle of the slide are some of the folks that you may end up interacting with. But I also do want to recognize that the greater ACPF community, all of you guys are part of our team as well. The hub is set up with a national focus, but it's the individual state user groups, the individual watershed planners, conservationists, GIS specialists, and on that are the ones out there applying the framework, and you're serving as the subject matter experts in the local community. It's always your feedback and involvement with ACPF is what is critical to really completing our mission. And then, so looking forward at some of those products and services we are currently providing, on the technical side, we do distribute the latest versions of our toolbox through our website, the acpfforwatersheds.org. Our technical team will fix bugs as they're reported to us or as we find them, and then we'll install new enhancements for the toolbox. And then the technical team is also maintaining that national database of ACPF core data. It's a quality controlled and updated annually with soils and land use data. We also host the ACPF forum where the community can help each other troubleshoot, and then we moderate that as well. If the community isn't chiming in, our technical experts will give feedback as well. And then we provide technical guidance with user manuals and are certainly available to consult regarding using ACPF in research out in the field. And then if you can't find, answers on our website or in the forum, we do have a dedicated email address for Toolbox support and feedback. And then looking at our training team, that group, we've got 2 technical trainings that we offer. We've got a cohort style group that's led by our tech experts. That is also going on right now this fall as well. And then we've got an online through our website, a self-paced course for the folks that want to maybe have that GIS experience already and just need to spend that 2 days getting up to speed on what ACPF is about. And then of course we've got our Watershed Applications class that everyone is participating in now. And then we can also look to design audience specific training or informational meetings based on specific needs of an organization, region, or a particular cohort. And then our communications and outreach group, the main product is that our website, which is really our centralized distribution center for all of our products and services. You're going to find on there a resource library that has both technical and non-technical materials in it. It's got case studies, use examples, guidance for engaging stakeholders, some tips for incorporating ACPF into planning processes. And then we've also got, access on there to all the ACPF peer-reviewed publications. And then also a frequently asked questions is available on there as well. Our communications team, we're also available to help connect users in the wider community. If the folks in Ohio want to, chat with the folks in Minnesota, we can certainly connect people up. Or, if you're in a state that's maybe new to ACPF, we can help make some of those connections as well. And then we do offer, we do periodic news and updates through email. Right now, we're looking at doing that about quarterly. And we will have everyone who is participating in this training on that mailing list so that you guys can stay connected with our news and updates going forward in the future. And I just wanted to throw this slide in here to talk about, some of the stats associated with our current products and services. You'll note the number of core data sets available in our national database. I do want to recognize the Ohio community that recently contributed over 100 watersheds to the national database. And then you'll notice that there's about 40% of our data sets that haven't been downloaded yet. So there's still a significant opportunity within our current database, for new regions and new watersheds to download and use ACPF that haven't yet. We do have jumping around a little bit, we have over 500 folks who have participated in various trainings over the years regarding ACPF. And then we do have over 800 folks that are receiving those periodic news and updates, staying in the loop on what's going on. And then I just want to highlight the Toolbox downloads, the ACPF Toolbox, and then our new tool, the Fine Art, to kind of segue into some of the recent projects that we've been working on and completed. First, of course, is our updated toolbox that we released earlier this year, version 4. The biggest thing with that was the Pro version now captures metadata for all the decisions that have been made in the process of running the toolbox and all the various scenarios that were discussed during session 1 of this training. And then We did also release on our website the companion economics tool, the financial and nutrient reduction tool, or as I mentioned, fine art, if you want to abbreviate that. The data behind the tool is currently only available in Iowa and Minnesota, but the tool itself helps ACPF users estimate costs associated with various selected conservation scenarios that have been run through ACPF, and it could also look at the nitrate reductions associated with those practices. And I am going to jump into chat here real quick and give you guys a link to a recent Iowa Learning Farms webinar that was given by our team member, Dr. Emily Zimmerman, who is one of the main researchers and that put together the fine art that is queued up to specifically talk more in detail about the fine art for those of you that are interested. And then, we've been updating our technical and watershed applications curriculum. And I especially want to, thank Matt and some of our other subject matter experts that have really lent a hand in helping us with that. That's always a continuing process to make these trainings relevant to you guys and easily accessible. Both for 508 compliance and get as many folks out there interested and applying the ACPF in their watersheds. We've also recently revamped our website. One of the biggest changes that you guys would see is that our resource library is now searchable. The FAQ that's in the resource library is searchable as well. I would encourage all of you to dig through there, search by topics, search by keywords, to look at some of those materials that we do have out there. And then we've also published a consultant directory. This is kind of an ongoing effort to add additional consultants or contractors to that directory. It's an effort for us to, if you're needing to contract with an outside partner to create new core data or to run the toolbox, this is an opportunity, is maybe a starting point for you if maybe you don't know who to reach out to. And then we've also set up a submission portal for core data if you are creating that on your own, so that our community can contribute to that national data set that we have. The 100 or so watersheds that the Ohio community contributed to earlier this year really did allow us to establish submission protocols and some quality control regarding that user submitted data. And then lastly, we did have representation at the SWCS conference in Denver this year. We did present a poster there. And if any of you on the call, you may or not be, but we are going to be joining the Iowa Water Conference in Dubuque tomorrow as well. So if you're there, great, I will see you there. And then finally, I want to touch on some of the projects that we've got in development, kind of like what Matt and Sam touched based on. We're looking at building an actual national scale for a repository for results data. We're looking to have this available for consumption by the NRCS and all the various partners. And the idea of the toolbox is really, once that watershed is run once, have it posted online and consumable by multiple parties. And then I do want to just say that, if you've got results that are already out in your watersheds that you would like to contribute to that, and as part of our design process, reach out to our technical team. We are looking for example watersheds that we can get launched with that, and make sure that the programming and the interface is working as it should. And then corresponding with that results platform, we're in the design phase to integrate those ACPF results as like a push into NRCS conservation desktop, to help those NRCS and SW and conservation district folks that are working at our NRCS offices consume those results within Watershed and within the conservation desktop planning modules. And then we are also, thinking about where we're going forward and expanding ACPF into new markets beyond the Corn Belt, beyond the Midwest. We're just having discussions at what resource needs are, once we start getting out some of those large agricultural tracts of land. And what the capabilities of the current toolbox are, what kind of enhancements we need. Interest in this course has really highlighted some of that interest that is out there nationwide, beyond the Midwest. And we are listening to those folks, Windy in California, we've got folks for South Dakota, out on East Coast that are really interested in making ACPF a go in their markets as well. And lastly, some of the toolbox enhancements we're looking at. Emily and her research team are working to expand the fine art economics tool beyond Iowa and Minnesota. And she's also working on how to appropriately incorporate phosphorus reductions within those economic models. And then in an upcoming version of the toolbox, we are going to be adding the NRCS SBI and two-stage ditches. So as options when you grow and run that toolbox. So those are some new things coming on the horizon, and that's really all I have. But again, I want to reiterate that you guys are part of our team, and we want to hear from you. We want to help you. If you need guidance on something, if you have barriers that you're encountering, have some discussions with us. We'll help you as best as we can to work through those. And we also want to hear from you about how you've applied what you've learned in this course in your home watersheds. And you can always contact us at either of these email addresses for general inquiries, the ACPF Hub at Iowa State, or the tech support at acpfsupport@iowastate.edu. And with that, I'll happily take any questions, or Marcel, it is all you.
Pam, thank you so much for giving us an overview on the National Hub, and thank you to everybody. Reminder that the agenda has a lot of these links. Most of the presentations I think are in there as well, if you need for getting these links. And I just want to check in with everybody and where everybody is at. And so I'm going to ask if you all would just type into the chat one word or a phrase of describing what are you feeling right now about ACPF. So one word or a phrase of where are you at right now? What do you think? I also want to encourage you to take a look at the list of participants that's in that folder and find those that are in your state and reach out to people and check in, because that's going to be your most important connections for making things happen with ACPF. And you should see an evaluation come to your inbox soon. And we'd really appreciate you taking some time to give us some feedback on what worked for you these last 3 sessions, what didn't work as well, and any suggestions you've got, because these training workshops are always a work in progress. All right, any other comments from anybody? Thank you all. Hope you enjoyed these 3 sessions, and I hope we can cross paths again on ACPF activities. You all have a great afternoon.